I do not know where the idea of a fearful and punishing God who has to be appeased with sacrificial offerings all the time comes from. But it is definitely not the biblical God of our Judeo-Christian tradition. You know, there is a funny little story in the book of the prophet Daniel, chapter 14, about a Babylonian god whose name was Bel, whom the Babylonians worshipped every day by offering him 6 bushels of fine flour, 40 sheep, and 6 measures of wine, araw-araw. Grabe, no? Apparently, everyone, including the king, worshipped this idol except Daniel, who was a Jew. When the king confronts Daniel and asks him why he was not worshiping his God, Daniel replied, "My lord the king, I worship only the living God who made heaven and earth and has dominion over all." Of course, the king reacted angrily. Now he says, "How dare you? How dare you say our God, Bel, is not a living God? Don't you see how much he eats and drinks every day?" Daniel replies and he says, "O king, that statue is only clay inside and bronze outside. It has never eaten or drunk anything." And so, the king confronts the temple priests and challenges them to prove that it is really the god, the Babylonian god Bel, who consumed all the food that they offered every day. You know, I suggest that you read the rest of the story and note how Daniel succeeds in proving his point to the king, how he managed to convince the king that the idea of a God who was always hungry and needed to be fed every day, otherwise he would get angry, was a scam. And that was promoted by the priests for a very self-serving purpose. Our readings today present the exact opposite. Instead of a hungry God who is demanding sacrifice all the time, what we hear is rather about a God who serves, a God who prepares a rich banquet for his people. He is not portrayed as a fearful God who is always threatening to punish the people in hell. Ewan ko nga ba, why a lot of people are so afraid of God, like they will always be punished in hell. What we hear about instead is about a God who desires to destroy the veil of grief that covers the lives of his beloved people. A God who consoles those who are grieving, who tenderly wipes away the tears from their faces. This is also the same image that we hear in our responsorial psalm today, the very famous Psalm 23. The psalmist is portraying God like a shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. A shepherd who tends his flock. He gives them repose in green pastures. He leads them beside restful waters. He refreshes their souls. He guides them along, especially when they have to pass through the dark valleys, so that they would not be afraid. Isn't this a wonderful thing to listen to as we confront COVID-19? He protects them. The psalm suddenly switches from the metaphor of the shepherd to that of a party host who spreads a table for his guests, who anoints their heads with oil, and who make sure that their cups are overflowing with wine. We get the same image of Jesus in our gospel today. He makes the blind see, the lame walk, the mute speak. He preaches good news to them, and he heals the sick among them. And after doing all that work for 3 days, take note, you would expect him to be demanding to be repaid or at least to be fed. Instead, he is still concerned about feeding them. Siya pang magpapakain. He does not even want them to line up for the food. Rather, he makes them sit down on the grass as in a banquet, and he asks his disciples to do the serving. I know that when we go through all kinds of calamities, like the ones that have visited us in this year 2020, volcanic eruption, a series of typhoons, and this COVID-19 pandemic, hindi natin alam kung kailan matatapos. We are tempted to think sometimes, hindi kaya pinaparusahan tayo? We are tempted to think that maybe God is angry with us, or that God is punishing us. Maybe we have to make some rich offerings and sacrifices na big time in order to appease God's anger? Well, in the book of the prophet Micah, chapter 6, the Israelite people were inclined to think in the same way, because they also went through calamities. They came to the prophet in order to figure out what they needed to do in order to please God. Para daw amuhin ng Diyos, para mawala na yung galit niya. Listen to what they ask the prophet. They say, "With what shall we come before the Lord and bow down before God Most High? Will we come before the Lord with burnt offerings? Will we bring calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased if we offer thousands of rams and myriad streams of oil? Will we give up our own firstborn children as a repayment for our crimes, the fruits of our bodies for the sins of our souls?" And here is what the prophet tells them in reply. "You have been told, O mortal, what is good and what the Lord requires of you. Only this, to do justice, to love goodness, and to walk humbly with your God." One of my favorite prayers at Mass is the preface number 4 that says the same thought, but even more beautifully. I want you to take it home with you. You know what it says? It says, "You have no need of our praise, yet our desire to thank you is itself your gift." Our prayer of thanksgiving adds nothing to your greatness, but it makes us grow in your grace.